My sister spent 30 years telling the world I was mentally unfit to handle my own life. She called it concern. I called it a countdown. She thought she'd finally erased me at her £1,000,000 gala. But she made one fatal mistake. She forgot I was the one holding the camera since 1994. My sister handed me the signed papers while smiling at the solicitors, knowing she had just stripped away the last of my inheritance. She forgot that a glass partition reflects more than just light. I sat in the corner of the room, adjusted my watch, and began the countdown. The tea was lukewarm, but she insisted on pouring it anyway. It is a specific kind of power play, the way she manages the porcelain, making sure my cup is never quite full enough. She leans back in the heavy Victorian armchair of our mother's drawing room in Surrey, her gaze drifting over me as if I were a piece of furniture that didn't quite fit the new aesthetic. I watch her hands. They are steady. They are always steady when she is rewriting someone else's reality. "You look tired, Leo," she says, her voice a soft blade. "Perhaps the city is becoming too much for your constitution." I don't answer immediately. I have learned that silence is a vacuum that she feels compelled to fill with her own arrogance. I simply watch the way she adjusts her pearls, the ones she told our father I had lost years ago. She doesn't know I saw them in her jewelry box 3 days after the funeral. She doesn't know that I've been watching the way she moves, the way she speaks, and the way she lies for a very long time. In the UK, we have a way of being polite that is more violent than a physical blow. We call it concern. My sister Sarah has mastered the art of being concerned until there is nothing left of you. She tells the neighbors I'm struggling with my mental health whenever I disagree with her. She tells our family friends that I'm financially unstable when I refuse to sign over my portion of the estate. She weaves a tapestry of incompetence around me, thread by thread, until I am cocooned in a reputation I didn't build. She has a habit, a verbal tic she uses whenever she is about to deliver a falsehood. She tilts her head, sighs deeply, and says, "I'm only saying this because I love you." It is the preamble to an execution. Today, the house feels cold, despite the heating being on full. Sarah is discussing the renovations. She talks about we, but she means I. She describes the plans to knock through the study, my father's study too, create a more open-plan living space for her consultancy events. She is a woman of influence now, a pillar of the community, a patron of local charities. Her public image is a polished diamond, bright enough to blind anyone who looks too closely. I sit by the window, observing the frost on the glass. I have a small device in my pocket, no larger than a coin. It has been active for 6 months. It isn't just in my pocket. It is in the study, the kitchen, and the hallway. I am not looking for one big secret. I am collecting the patterns. I am documenting the way she smiles after she hangs up the phone on a weeping relative. I am recording the way she speaks about our parents' legacy when she thinks the walls aren't listening. "Are you even listening, Leo?" she asks, that sharp edge returning to her tone. "I'm trying to include you in the legacy. I'm trying to make sure you have a place here, despite everything." Despite everything, I repeat. It's a beautiful phrase. It carries the weight of all the lies she's told about me. It implies a history of failure that only exists in her narratives. "Yes," I say quietly. "I'm listening, Sarah. I'm listening to every word." She smiles then, a genuine expression of triumph. She thinks she has one because I am not fighting. She thinks that because I don't raise my voice, I have no voice. She doesn't realize that a storm doesn't need to scream to be felt. It just needs to arrive. The afternoon light begins to fade, casting long, distorted shadows across the Persian rug. Sarah stands up, smoothing her skirt, ready to head to a committee meeting where she will no doubt be praised for her grace under pressure. During the family's morning period, "Don't forget to lock the back door when you leave, dear," she says, heading for the coat rack. "You've been so forgetful lately. I'd hate for something else to go missing." She leaves, and the house settles into a heavy, expectant silence. I walk into the study. I look at the bookshelf where the camera is hidden behind the leather-bound volumes of law. I check the feed on my phone. The resolution is perfect. I see her from 3 hours ago, mocking my slow-witted nature to her business partner over the phone, laughing about how easy it was to get me to sign the management agreement that effectively signs away my rights to the property. I don't feel anger. Anger is a hot, messy emotion that leads to mistakes. I feel a cold, crystalline clarity. I have years of this. Years of her gaslighting our mother into thinking her memory was failing. Years of her convincing our father that I was stealing from the business. I have it all: the whispers, the calculated smiles, the moments where the mask slipped when she thought she was alone. I sit in my father's chair. I have enough footage now to fill a lifetime of documentaries. But I only need one night. One specific night, when the perfect daughter invites the entire board, the local press, and our extended family to celebrate her new foundation. She thinks she is building a monument to herself. She doesn't realize she is just building the stage for her own unveiling. I check the file sizes. I check the backups. I have been the silent observer for 30 years. It is time for the silent observer to become the narrator. I look out at the dark garden, the UK winter biting at the glass. My sister thinks I am the weak link in the family chain. She thinks I am the one who needs to be managed, pitied, and eventually discarded. She has no idea that I am the one who has been keeping the record. The question is, how long can a person live in a house made of glass before they forget that stones even exist? The invitation was embossed in gold, thick enough to feel like a slab of marble in my hand. It announced the inaugural gala for the Elmsworth Heritage Foundation, Sarah's crowning achievement. She had spent 18 months positioning herself as the guardian of our family's history, all while systematically dismantling the very man who built it. As I stood in the hallway of my small flat in London, looking at the card, I realized she had even used our father's favorite font. It was a detail designed to twist a knife I was supposed to be too dull to feel. I arrived at the manor house 40 minutes early. In the UK, showing up early to a formal event is a sign of social desperation. But for me, it was tactical. I needed to see the mechanics of her deception before the grease of champagne and small talk covered the gears. The house looked magnificent. Sarah had spent a fortune of the estate's liquid assets on staging. Florists from Chelsea were draping the banisters in the white. For Pure Tiand, the catering staff moved with the precision of a clockwork army. Sarah was in the center of the foyer, wearing a dress that cost more than my first car. She was radiant. She was the picture of the grieving yet resilient daughter. When she saw me, her eyes did that familiar flick, a quick scan for flaws in my suit, my posture, my very existence. "Leo, you're here," she said, gliding toward me. She didn't hug me. She touched my shoulder in a way that looked affectionate from a distance, but felt like a shepherd checking a sheep for rot. "I've put you at table 12. It's near the back, by the kitchen doors. I thought you'd prefer it. Less noise for your nerves. Table 12. "Thank you, Sarah," I replied. My voice was level, a flat lake. She tilted her head, that familiar sigh escaping her lips. "I'm only saying this because I love you, but do try not to corner the trustees tonight. They're here to celebrate the foundation, not to hear about your grievances with the probate. It's been a year, Leo. It's time to let go." She didn't wait for a response. She never did. To Sarah, my silence was an admission of defeat, a white flag I flew every day of my life. She turned to greet a local member of parliament, her voice shifting instantly into a melodic, high society lilt. I watched her walk away. I noticed the way she subtly adjusted her stance to appear more vulnerable when speaking to the older men, and more commanding when speaking to the staff. She was a chameleon in silk. By 8 p.m., the room was packed. The who's who of the county were there: solicitors, land developers, local politicians, and the extended family members who had long ago stopped calling me because Sarah told them I was going through a difficult reclusion. I sat at table 12. The draft from the kitchen was cold, and the clatter of plates provided a rhythmic backdrop to my isolation. I was the ghost at the feast, the inconvenient truth hidden behind a floral arrangement. The meal was a masterclass in performative tradition. Between courses, Sarah stood at the podium. She spoke of our father's vision, and our mother's gentle spirit. She spoke of the importance of preserving the integrity of the family name. "My brother and I," she said, casting a pitying look toward my dark corner, "have had a difficult journey since the passing of our parents. It hasn't always been easy to see eye to eye on the future of this estate, but I have taken it upon myself to ensure that the Elmsworth legacy remains untarnished, even when those closest to it lack the clarity to see its value." The room murmured in sympathy. A woman at a nearby table looked at me and whispered something to her husband. He shook his head, a look of profound disappointment crossing his face. I was being erased in real time. This was Sarah's greatest talent. She didn't just take your money or your land. She took your right to be respected. She replaced your character with a caricature of her own making. The betrayal wasn't just in the words. It was in the silence she forced upon me. Every time I had tried to speak up during the settling of the will, she had used her concern to invalidate me. "Leo is just emotional," she'd told the lawyers. "He hasn't been himself since the breakdown." There had been no breakdown. Only a week where I had stayed in bed after our mother's funeral. Paralyzed by a grief Sarah seemed entirely immune to. She had used that week to paint a picture of a man mentally unfit to manage his own affairs. The symbolic blow came during the toast. Sarah invited the lead trustee of the foundation, a man named Sir Alistair, to the stage. To the future, Sir Alistair announced, raising his glass. And to the woman who sacrificed her own inheritance to ensure this house became a public treasure. Sarah, your selflessness is an inspiration. The room erupted in applause. I sat still. I knew the truth. Sarah hadn't sacrificed anything. She had moved the assets into a complex web of offshore trusts that she controlled. While the foundation was merely a tax-efficient shell that paid her a consultancy fee equivalent to the house's yearly revenue. She was being toasted for a theft so elegant it looked like charity. As the applause died down, Sarah caught my eye. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible smirk. It was the look of a predator who had finally finished its meal. She thought the erasure was complete. She thought she had finally buried me under a mountain of gold-leafed lies. I felt the weight of the hard drive in my jacket pocket. It was cold against my chest. For months, I had been the unstable brother, the failure, the quiet one. I had let her build this podium. I had let her gather the audience. I had let her sharpen the blade. Because the higher she climbed, the more air there would be beneath her when the floor vanished. A server approached me with a bottle of expensive champagne. "Would you like a refill, sir?" "No," I said, standing up. "I think I've had enough of what's being served here." I walked toward the back of the room, past the heavy velvet curtains, toward the AV booth, where a young technician was managing the slideshow of family photos playing on the large screens. Sarah was busy being hugged by a line of admirers. She didn't notice me slip behind the curtain. She didn't notice the way I looked at the master laptop, the one connected to every screen in the ballroom, the one that would soon display the commemorative legacy video she had commissioned. She had spent 30 years writing my story for me. She had spent 10 years gaslighting our parents into believing I was the villain, and she was the saint. She had used her charm to isolate me, her influence to bankrupt me, and her love to destroy me. I looked at the technician. He was 20, overworked, and bored. "The mistress of the house wants a slight change to the playback order," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen pond. "She wants the unedited archive file to play first. It's on this drive." She said it's a surprise for the board. I handed him the drive. I didn't tremble. I didn't feel the rush of adrenaline that usually accompanies a confrontation. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a correction. He looked at the drive, then at the guest list. "Table 12. You're the brother, right?" "I am," I said. "And I've been waiting a long time to show everyone exactly what kind of family we are." He plugged it in. The file names were innocuous. family_meeting_draft.mp4, study_audio_log.wav, solicitor_prep.mov. To him, they looked like boring administrative files. To me, they were the DNA of a monster. I walked back into the ballroom. I didn't go back to table 12. I stood at the very edge of the light, near the exit. I watched Sarah. She was laughing now, her head tilted back, her pearls gleaming under the chandeliers. She looked perfect. She looked untouchable. The lights dimmed. The room went quiet. A hush of anticipation fell over the crowd as they prepared to see the curated, edited, and polished version of the Elmsworth history. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed. "Please direct your attention to the screens for a special look at the heart of our foundation." I checked my watch. The first clip on the drive wasn't a photo of our father. It was a video from 3 weeks ago. It was Sarah, alone in the study, practicing her grieving speech in front of a mirror, mocking our mother's dying words between takes while she sipped a gin and tonic. The screen flickered to life. The first sound that filled the room wasn't the planned orchestral music. It was Sarah's voice, sharp and cold, saying, "If the old man doesn't sign the codicil by Friday, I'll just tell the doctor he's hallucinating again. Leo won't do anything. Leo never does anything." The room froze. The silence was so sudden it felt like a physical weight. I looked at Sarah. The glass of champagne was halfway to her lips. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. The chameleon had finally encountered a color it couldn't replicate. The truth. But this was only the first 30 seconds. I had 6 hours of footage. If a reputation is built on 1,000 lies, does it take 1,000 truths to tear it down? Or just the right one, told at the right time? The silence in the ballroom was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the silence of respect or the silence of a pause. It was the sound of 1,000 people holding their collective breath, waiting for the reality they lived in to snap back into place. On the screen, Sarah's face, the unedited private version, loomed large. She was laughing on the video, a jagged, mocking sound that vibrated through the high-end speakers. "Leo is such a bore," The digital Sarah said, her voice echoing off the gilded ceiling. He actually thinks the estate is about family values. He doesn't realize that values are for people who can't afford lawyers. The real Sarah stood frozen. The champagne glass in her hand didn't shatter. She was too composed for that, but her knuckles were white. The skin pulled tight over her bones. I watched her from the shadows. I watched the way her head slowly turned toward the AV booth, then toward the screen. Then finally, desperately, toward the crowd. She was looking for an out. She was looking for a way to turn this into a glitch, a hack, or a cruel joke. But I hadn't just played one clip. I had programmed the sequence with the meticulous care of a watchmaker. As she opened her mouth to speak, the screen flickered to a different date. A timestamp appeared in the corner, October 14th, to 14 a.m. It was the hallway outside our mother's bedroom, 2 nights before she passed. The camera was low, hidden in a decorative vase I'd placed there months prior. The footage showed Sarah walking into the room. She wasn't carrying medicine. She was carrying a stack of papers. The audio was faint but clear enough. "Just sign here, Mum. It's for the taxes. You don't want the government taking the house, do you, Leo?" "No, Leo's not coming. He said he was too busy with work. Just sign." Our mother's voice was a mere whisper, a ghost of the woman she had been. "But Leo, he said he'd be here. He lied. Mum, he always lies." In the ballroom, the MP she had been flirting with earlier took a sharp step back. Sir Alistair, the trustee who had toasted her selflessness only minutes ago, lowered his glass. His face had turned a deep, mottled purple. The social fabric of the Elmsworth family was being unraveled, thread by thread, in front of the very people who were supposed to be its seamstresses. I didn't stay to watch her face for long. I knew that look. I had lived under the shadow of her concern for a decade. I knew that if I stayed, she would find a way to make me the aggressor. She would scream, or cry, or claim I had faked the footage with AI. She would try to pull me into the mud, where she had spent her life wrestling. I walked out the side door into the biting Surrey night. The air was crisp, smelling of damp earth and the coming winter. I didn't feel the rush of a victor. I felt a profound, heavy emptiness. To save my father's legacy, I had to burn the house down with both of us inside. I didn't go back to my flat in London. I knew the press, or at least the local tabloids, would be looking for the disgruntled brother by morning. Instead, I drove to a small bed and breakfast in the Cotswolds, a place where the Wi-Fi was spotty and the owners didn't care about the news. I had prepared for this month-long disappearance. I had my laptop, my documents, and a burner phone. For the first 3 days, I did nothing but sleep. The exhaustion of being a silent observer for 3 decades had finally caught up to me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the patterns of her lies. I saw the way she had systematically isolated me from my cousins, my childhood friends, and eventually, my own parents. On the 4th day, I opened my laptop. The fallout was exactly what I had engineered. The Elmsworth Gala incident was trending on social media. Someone had recorded the screen with their phone and uploaded it. The headlines were brutal. Socialite's secret shame. The foundation of lies, and Surrey's perfect daughter exposed. Sarah had released a statement. Of course, it was a masterpiece of gaslighting. She claimed the footage was deepfake technology used by a mentally unstable sibling in an attempt at extortion. She spoke of her heartbreak, that I would stoop so low to tarnish their parents' memory. I read her words and felt a small, cold smile touch my lips. She was using the old playbook. She was trying to shift the focus back to my instability, but she had made one fatal mistake. She assumed I had shown everything I had. I began the second phase of my strategy. Revenge is not a single act of violence. It is a series of quiet, inevitable decisions. I began sending the paperwork lock files to the authorities and the estate's true creditors. While Sarah was busy fighting the PR battle in the newspapers, I was fighting the legal battle in the ledgers. For months, I had been working with a forensic accountant I'd met in secret. We had found the trail. Sarah hadn't just been manipulative, she had been sloppy. She had diverted funds from the foundation into a holding company, used to pay off her own gambling debts. Habits she had kept hidden from everyone, including me, until I saw the bank statements she thought she'd shredded. I sat in the quiet of the B&B, the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway the only sound. I spent 18 hours a day, cross-referencing her consultancy fees with the foundation's expenditures. I found the invoices for the lilies, the catering, and the gold-embossed invitations, all billed as community outreach and heritage preservation. I sent the files to the Charity Commission. I sent the bank statements to the Inland Revenue. I didn't include a note. I didn't include a manifesto. I simply sent the truth, organized in chronological order, with footnotes. Time began to blur. Weeks turned into a month. I watched from a distance as the Elmsworth Heritage Foundation was placed under interim management. I watched as Sarah's influential friends began to delete their photos with her. The invitation lists for the county's elite events were quietly revised. She wasn't being shouted at. She was being erased. The same weapon she had used against me was now being turned on her by the very society she craved. The point of no return came on a Tuesday morning. I received an email from our family solicitor, Mr. Henderson. He had been a loyal friend of our father, but Sarah had convinced him years ago that I was a liability. Leo, the email read, I have reviewed the documents you sent regarding the offshore transfers. I have no words for my own blindness. I am resigning as the estate's representative. I have advised Sarah to seek criminal counsel. I am so sorry. I didn't reply. An apology from a man who had helped her rob me didn't mean much now. I wasn't looking for apologies. I was looking for the restoration of the record. I took a walk through the rolling hills of the Cotswolds. The frost was thick on the ground, making the grass look like it was made of glass. I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't waiting for Sarah to tell me who I was. I had been the weak brother because I allowed her to define the terms of our relationship. I had been silent because I thought silence was a shield. It wasn't. Silence was a reservoir, and I had finally opened the gates. I checked my burner phone. There were 17 missed calls from Sarah. She hadn't left a single voicemail until the last one. I played it. Her voice was unrecognizable. The polished, melodic lilt was gone. It was replaced by something thin, reedy, and desperate. Leo, you think you've won. You've destroyed everything. The house is going to be seized. The name is mud. I hope you're happy in your little hole. You're just like Dad. You're a parasite who ruins everything he touches. Pick up the phone, you coward. I'm only saying this because I love you. You're going to end up alone. She used the phrase again. Even at the end, she couldn't let go of the social tactic that had served her so well. But the power was gone. The words were just noise. I looked at the phone and then at the horizon. I had lost the house. I had lost the money. I had lost the family name. But as I stood there in the cold, I realized I had never actually had those things. They were just the stage sets Sarah had used to keep me in my place. I deleted the voicemail. I removed the SIM card from the burner phone and dropped it into a deep, muddy puddle by the side of the road. I had spent my life as a character in her play. Now, the theater was empty. The lights were out, and the director was screaming at an empty room. I began my drive back to London. Not to reclaim the estate, but to start a life where my name didn't require a footnote or an explanation. I had one final task to complete. A meeting with a journalist from The Guardian, who wanted to know not just about the fraud, but about the psychology of a family betrayal. Sarah's greatest fear wasn't poverty. It was being understood. It was the world seeing her not as a villain, but as something much more pathetic. A small, insecure woman who could only feel tall by cutting the legs off everyone around her. As the London skyline appeared on the horizon, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had played the long game. I had been patient. I had been the silent cameraman of my own tragedy. But as I reached for my gear to prepare for the interview, I noticed a small, unmarked envelope in my glove box. I hadn't put it there. I pulled over and opened it. Inside was a single photograph from our childhood. It was Sarah and me, sitting on the garden swing. On the back, in our mother's handwriting, it said, "Always look after each other. You are all you have." I stared at the photo for a long time. Justice is a cold dish, and sometimes it leaves you with a hunger that no amount of vindication can satisfy. Did I destroy her because I wanted justice? Or because I wanted her to finally look at me and see a person instead of a shadow? The first time Sarah realized she could no longer control the narrative was not when the video played, but 3 weeks later, when the silence began to echo. In our circles, a scandal is often followed by a flurry of frantic phone calls and whispered defenses. But the evidence I had released was so cold, so indisputable, that there was nothing to defend. The social elite of Surrey didn't argue with her. They simply stopped acknowledging her existence. I moved back to London, into a modest apartment that Sarah didn't have the address to. I kept my phone on Do Not Disturb, allowing only a few select numbers through. One of them was the forensic accountant. The other was the liquidator. Sarah, meanwhile, was trapped in the manor house. It was a mausoleum of her own making. Through the legal updates from Mr. Henderson's replacement, I tracked her descent. She had begun to experience a specific kind of panic, the panic of a person who has always played the puppet master and suddenly realizes the strings have been cut. She sent me an email on a Tuesday morning. The subject line was blank. "Leo, The bank has frozen the foundation's primary account. There must be a mistake. I've called Sir Alistair, but his assistant says he's in the Maldives. I know you're behind this audit. Stop this nonsense immediately. I am the only one who can save the estate from being sold to developers. You are biting the hand that feeds you. I didn't reply. I sat in a small coffee shop in Southwark, watching the rain streak the windows, and thought about the hand that feeds. For years, she had fed me scraps of my own inheritance, while convinced me I was lucky to have them. The confusion phase of her downfall was fascinating to observe from a distance. Because I remained polite and distant in every legal filing, Sarah had no target to strike. She was a boxer swinging at a fog. She expected a shouting match. I gave her a spreadsheet. She expected a confrontation. I gave her a court-ordered freeze on assets. By the second month, the panic had turned into a frantic, public unraveling. She began posting on her social media, the same accounts she used to promote her charitable works. The posts were rambling, defenses of her character, interspersed with childhood photos of us. She was trying to evoke a sentimentality that she had spent decades killing. My brother is unwell, one post read. He has been manipulated by outsiders who want to steal the Elmsworth legacy. I am doing everything in my power to protect him from himself. The comments were a graveyard. People she had known for 20 years simply ignored the posts. A few former friends left clinical, one-sentence replies asking for the return of borrowed items or the resignation from committee boards. The social death was far more painful for her than any financial loss. To Sarah, being ignored was a fate worse than being hated. I received a physical letter at my solicitor's office. It was handwritten, the ink slightly smeared. Leo, I'm at the house. The heating has been cut off. There's a man at the gate with a repossession notice for the Range Rover. Why aren't you answering? I've done everything for this family. I stayed and looked after Mum while you were off in London playing at being an architect. I earned this. Please, just tell them you made a mistake. Tell them the footage was a joke. I'll give you whatever you want. Just make it stop. I read the letter twice. There was no I'm sorry. There was only make it stop. Even in the face of total ruin. Her only concern was the discomfort of the consequences, not the weight of the betrayal. She still viewed me as a tool, a lever she could pull to reset the game. I decided it was time for a visit. Not to the house, but to the firm managing the liquidation. I walked into the glass-walled office in the city. I looked at the maps of the estate, now marked with red sale pending stickers. The Elmsworth Foundation was being dismantled to pay back the creditors Sarah had defrauded. The house, our childhood home, was being sold to a boutique hotel group. Mr. Elmsworth, the liquidator said, looking up from his files, we've managed to secure the personal items you requested. The rest of the furniture will go to auction on Friday. And my sister, I asked. She refused to leave the premises. We had to involve the local authorities to serve the final eviction notice. She was distressed. She kept insisting there was a second will, one that gave her total autonomy. There is no second will, I said quietly. I felt a twinge of something that wasn't quite pithy. It was more like the feeling of watching an old, diseased tree finally fall in a storm. It's sad to see the height lost, but the air is clearer once it's down. I drove down to Surrey that afternoon. I didn't go to the front gate. I parked on the lane and walked the perimeter fence until I reached the spot where the woods met the garden. I saw her through the trees. Sarah was standing on the terrace. She was wearing a trench coat that looked too big for her. She was pacing 3 steps left, 3 steps right, her behavioral signature of control now reduced to a frantic, repetitive motion. She was talking to someone on her phone, her voice carrying across the lawn. No, you don't understand. My brother is a schizophrenic. He's fabricated everything. Listen to me. I am Sarah Elmsworth. She stopped. She looked at the phone. Whoever was on the other end had hung up. She stood there, looking out at the gardens that were no longer hers, in a world that no longer believed her. She looked small. For the first time in my life, I realized she wasn't a giant who had stepped on me. She was just a person who had been standing on a very tall, very fragile pedestal. I didn't step out from the trees. I didn't want the satisfaction of her seeing me. That would be a confrontation, and I had promised myself there would be none. I wanted the silence to be the final word. I turned and walked back to my car. As I started the engine, my phone buzzed. It was a text from her. I see your car, Leo. I know you're there. Come and face me. You're a coward. You've always been a coward. I didn't look back at the house. I drove toward the motorway. The consequences were only beginning. The legal system in the UK is slow, but it is relentless once the gears of a fraud investigation begin to turn. The Charity Commission had already handed their file to the police. The social consequences were over. The criminal ones were about to start. I thought about the perfect daughter image she had cultivated. It was gone. In its place was a trail of forensic evidence, and a reputation that smelled of desperation. When I reached my flat in London, I found a small box on my doorstep. It was from the liquidators. Inside were the few personal items I had asked for: my father's fountain pen, my mother's favorite tea set, and the old film reels from the 1980s. I realized then that Sarah hadn't just lost the house and the money. She had lost the ability to be the narrator of our lives. She was no longer the one telling the story. I was. And I was choosing to end her chapter with a period, not an exclamation point. But as I sat down to look through the old film reels, I noticed one canister was missing. The one labeled Summer 1994. It was the summer our parents had set up the original trust. I remembered Sarah's face on the terrace, the way she looked at her phone, as if it were a weapon that had misfired. If she had lost everything, why was she still trying to call the one person she claimed to hate? The final meeting didn't take place in a courtroom or a solicitor's office. It took place in a small, sterile visiting room of a police station in Guildford. Sarah had been brought in for questioning, under caution regarding the offshore transfers and the systematic embezzlement of the foundation's funds. Her legal aid, since she could no longer afford the silver-tongued barristers of the city, had requested my presence. They thought I might be the only one who could talk her into a plea deal. When I walked into the room, the smell of industrial floor cleaner and stale coffee hit me. It was a far cry from the scent of lilies, an expensive perfume that usually followed my sister. Sarah was sitting at a metal table. Her hair, usually a perfect architectural feat, was lank. Her skin looked gray under the fluorescent lights. She didn't look up when I sat down. She was staring at her hands, which were stripped of their rings. The perfect daughter was gone. In her place was a woman who looked every day of her 50 years. "You look well, Leo," she said. Her voice was a dry rasp. "I suppose the spoils of war suit you." "There were no spoils, Sarah," I said softly. "The house is sold. The foundation is dissolved. I'm living in a 2-bedroom flat. There is nothing left to win." She finally looked at me. There was no fire in her eyes, just a cold, hollow vacuum. "Then why did you do it? All those years of playing the victim, just to burn it all down at the end. You could have had half. You could have just asked." "I did ask," I reminded her. "I asked for transparency. I asked for the truth about the medical reports for Mom. You told me I was being paranoid. You told me I was unstable. You made a public spectacle of my grief, to hide your own greed." She tilted her head, a ghostly remnant of her social habit. She began to sigh, the preamble to a lie, but she stopped halfway. She realized the tactic had no audience here. "I have something for you," I said, placing a small tablet on the table between us. "I've seen enough of your videos," she spat. "This isn't one of mine. It's from the missing canister. Summer 1994. I pressed play. The footage was grainy, overexposed by the bright British sun of a July 30 years ago. It showed our father sitting on the terrace of the manor. He looked young, strong, and deeply happy. Beside him was a 14-year-old Sarah. They were looking at a set of documents. In the video, our father speaks. "Sarah, I'm putting the primary trust in your name when you come of age. Not because I don't trust Leo, but because he has the heart of an artist. He'll want to build things. You have the mind for the business. But you must promise me. The trust is the floor beneath his feet. It's not your ladder. It's his safety." The young Sarah in the video nods solemnly. "I promise, Dad. I'll take care of him. I'm only doing this because I love him." The Sarah sitting across from me flinched, as her own teenage voice echoed through the interrogation room. The phrase, her signature weapon, her lifelong mask, had started as a genuine promise. It had been the original truth that she had distorted into 1,000 lies. "He trusted you first," I said, my voice devoid of malice. "That was your power. And you used the very phrase he taught you as a way to gaslight me for 3 decades. You turned his love into a cage." Sarah stared at the screen as the video faded to black. A single tear tracked through the heavy foundation on her cheek, leaving a jagged line of ruin. This was the moment of absolute exposure. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the fact that she had known, from the very beginning, exactly what she was destroying. "What do you want, Leo?" she whispered. "An apology? You won't get one. I did what I had to do to keep that house standing while you were off dreaming." "I don't want an apology," I said, standing up. "And I'm not here to help your solicitors with a plea. I'm here to tell you that I've handed this footage to the prosecution, not as evidence of fraud, but as evidence of intent. They wanted to know when the deception started. I'm showing them it started in 1994. The panic finally broke through her frozen exterior. She reached across the table, her fingers clawing at my sleeve. Leo, wait. You can't. If they use that, the judge will see it as premeditated. I'll get years. I'll lose everything. You already lost everything, Sarah, I said, gently disengaging her hand. The difference is, now you have to live in the world you built. A world where no one believes a word you say. I walked toward the door. The heavy magnetic lock clicked, ready to release. Leo, she screamed, her voice cracking. I'm your sister. I'm the only one who knows who you really are. I paused at the door. I didn't turn around. No, Sarah. You're the only one who tried to convince me I was someone else. I finally know who I am. I'm the one who stayed quiet until the truth was the only thing left in the room. I stepped out into the hallway. The door shut with a heavy, final thud. I walked past the officers, past the solicitors, and out into the grey Surrey afternoon. The power had shifted, but it didn't feel like a heavy weight being lifted. It felt like a surgical removal. The cancer of her influence was gone, but the scar would remain forever. I had delivered justice without a single shout, without a single act of violence. I had simply held up a mirror and waited for her to realize she couldn't stand the sight of her own reflection. As I walked to my car, I saw Sir Alistair pulling into the station parking lot. He saw me and stopped, his face a mask of awkward shame. He looked like he wanted to say something, to offer a handshake, an explanation, a way back into the fold. I simply nodded to him, a polite, distant gesture, and kept walking. I didn't need his validation anymore. I didn't need the community's respect. I had the one thing Sarah could never buy, steal, or lie her way into. I had the final word. The sun began to set over the hills, casting long shadows that stretched toward the horizon. The manor house would be someone else's hotel by next month. The Elmsworth name would be a cautionary tale in the local papers for a week. And then it would fade into the background noise of the county. I got into my car and started the engine. For the first time in my life, there was no countdown. No recording device in my pocket. No need to watch the reflection in the glass. I drove away from the station, away from the estate, and toward the city. The justice was done. But as I looked in the rearview mirror, I wondered, if you spend your whole life fighting a ghost, who are you supposed to be once the haunting finally stops? Simply move to the edges of the room. The Elmsworth Manor was no longer a home. It was the Elm 6 months later. The dust in Surrey had settled, but it hadn't disappeared. It had Sworth Boutique and Spa. The heavy Victorian furniture had been replaced by minimalist Scandinavian designs, and the drawing room where Sarah used to pour her tepid tea was now a bar serving overpriced gin to tourists who didn't know our names. I stood across the street, wearing a coat that didn't mark me as anyone important. I watched a group of weekenders laugh as they walked through the front doors. They were walking over the threshold, where I had spent 30 years being told I was a failure. It was strange. The building looked the same, but the soul had been bleached out of it. Justice in the real world is rarely as clean as it is in the movies. Sarah had taken a plea deal. The summer 1994 footage, combined with the forensic trail of the offshore accounts, had left her with no room to maneuver. She was serving a 3-year sentence in a low-security facility. It wasn't a dungeon, but for a woman whose entire identity was built on the height of her social pedestal. The grey walls and the loss of her pearls were a slow-motion execution of the spirit. I had received a letter from her 2 weeks ago. I hadn't opened it until this morning. "Dear Leo," it began. The handwriting was no longer elegant. It was cramped and shaky. "I saw in the papers that you sold the remaining family heirlooms at auction. I hope the pittance you received was worth the destruction of our history. You think you've won because you're free, but you're just as trapped as I am. You have no family left. You have no legacy. You're just a man in a flat with a laptop full of ghosts. I forgive you, Leo. I'm only saying this because I love you." I folded the letter and placed it back in my pocket. She was still trying to use the old spell. Even from a prison cell, she was attempting to define my reality. She wanted me to feel the weight of loneliness, because that was the only weapon she had left. But as I looked at the manor, I realized she was wrong. I hadn't destroyed our history. I had simply stopped the lie from becoming the only version of it. I didn't feel like a victor. I felt like a survivor. The cost of justice had been the erasure of my past. To stop her, I'd had to dismantle the very thing I was trying to protect, the idea of a family. I had no sister now. I had no childhood home. I had the truth, but the truth is a cold bedfellow when the wind picks up. I walked toward the village cemetery. It was a short walk, the kind our parents used to take on Sunday afternoons. I found their headstone clean, simple, and finally, quiet. Sarah had planned to move them to a more prestigious plot as part of her foundation's PR campaign. I had blocked the exclamation. They stayed where they were, under the shade of an old oak tree, away from the cameras and the brochures. I sat on the low stone wall. I thought about the quiet revenge I had taken. There had been no screaming matches, no shattered glass, no dramatic courtroom outbursts. I had simply let the clock tick. I had gathered the facts, waited for the right moment, and stepped aside to let the weight of her own actions crush her. A woman from the village, Mrs. Gable, walked past with her dog. She had been a friend of my mother's. She stopped, recognizing me, and gave a small, hesitant nod. It wasn't the pitying look she used to give me when Sarah told her I was struggling. It was a look of profound discomfort. "Leo," she said, I suppose things are as they should be now." "I suppose they are, Mrs. Gable," I replied politely. "It's a shame about the house. Such a shame. The house was just bricks," I said. "The shame was what happened inside it." She looked away, unable to meet my eyes. The village didn't want to talk about the betrayal. They wanted the perfect family back, even if it was a lie. My presence reminded them that they had been fooled, and people rarely forgive you for showing them their own gullibility. I stood up and brushed the moss from my trousers. I had done what I set out to do. I had restored the record. I had protected my father's intent, even if the house was gone. I had shown the world who Sarah was, and in doing so, I had discovered who I wasn't. I wasn't the weak brother. I wasn't the unstable one. I was the one who remembered. I drove back to London, leaving the village and the boutique hotel behind. My new life was small, but it was mine. I was working as a consultant for a firm that specialized in digital forensics, using the skills I'd honed while tracking my sister to help others find their own truths. As I reached my apartment, I sat in the car for a moment, listening to the engine cool. I realized I would never get an apology that mattered. I would never have a moment where Sarah looked at me and said, "I was wrong." That kind of closure is a myth. The justice I had achieved was clinical. It was a settled ledger. It was the absence of a lie. I walked up the stairs to my flat. I made a cup of tea, filling the cup to the very top, exactly the way I liked it. I sat at my desk and opened a new file on my computer. I wasn't recording anyone anymore. I was writing. I looked at the photograph of the garden swing one last time before tucking it into a drawer. The haunting had stopped, but the silence remained. And perhaps that was the most intelligent revenge of all. To live a life so quiet and so honest that her voice could never find a place to echo again. They finally understood. I didn't explain further. Some truths don't need witnesses.